In our last lecture, we started talking about lipids, and lipids are fats, right? So we talked about the fact that you can have a liquid fat in the form of an oil, like vegetable oil or olive oil, and we talked about the fact that lipids can be solid, like things like beef fat or butter or lard. And what makes one liquid versus solid is it saturated or is it unsaturated, right? So when you think of a fat, you should think of something called a triglyceride. And just as a reminder, a triglyceride is called that because it's got a glycerol molecule attached to 3 fatty acids. Now, a fatty acid is really just a chain of carbons with hydrogens attached to it. That's all a fatty acid is. And they get pretty long, and that's why fats are kind of bulky. They're bigger molecules than carbohydrates, which are sugars. But what ends up happening is those carbons could have all hydrogens attached, and that would be a saturated fat. Or they can have some of those carbons might have double bonds, and it might not have a hydrogen attached to it. That would be an unsaturated fat. And remember, unsaturated fats are liquid, and saturated fats are going to be solid. So that's just a quick review of what I talked about in the last video. What we're going to talk about today is another type of fat called cholesterol. And cholesterol is not, it's made in the liver, so we'll talk about that a little bit today. So your body actually makes cholesterol. You eat it too, you get it, but most of the cholesterol in your body, your liver actually makes. And when you think of cholesterol, what you should think of is kind of think like a melted waxy candle. So if you've ever melted a candle before and you've seen the wax kind of pour over the side, that liquid, like soft wax, that is essentially what cholesterol would look like and feel like. And it's made out of fat. And it gets carried around your body, in your blood, and it's used for all kinds of things. It's used in the cell membrane. So when we talk about the cell membrane in the next unit, we're going to be talking about the fact that it needs to be strong, right? Think of your house, right? If I were to build a house and put a bunch of bricks together, I want mortar in there. I want something kind of sticking the bricks together. So think of cholesterol as being a really important part of making those cell membranes. So it allows the cell membrane to stay strong and structural. Also, cholesterol gets used for things like hormones. If you've ever heard of hormones before, they're little chemicals that travel around your body. They're molecules that turn things on and turn things off. Like, for example, you had a growth spurt probably a year or two ago, and you got a little taller. That's because of a hormone called growth hormone. So basically, very important molecule, cholesterol. It gets used in a lot of parts of the body. But here's the problem. Cholesterol is a fat, right? And as we know, fats are nonpolar, so they don't really dissolve in water. And if you remember me talking about water, blood is mostly made of water. So that's a problem, right? So how is the water in the blood going to be able to carry around these fats, cholesterol, when they're not, nonpolar? It doesn't want to attract to it. So the way that the body solves that problem is with these things called lipoproteins. And what a lipoprotein is, it's fat attached to a protein, and proteins can attract to water. So think of lipo or lipoproteins as like little cars that pick up cholesterol and carries it around the body to where it needs to go. And there's actually more than 2, but we're just going to talk about 2 kinds. There's 2 kinds of lipoproteins in the human body or in living things. There's something called an LDL, or a low-density lipoprotein, and something called an HDL, which is a high-density lipoprotein. So I'm just going to talk about the differences between them and why it's dangerous, because you've probably heard that before, right? Watch your cholesterol. If you have too much cholesterol in your blood, it can cause some problems, and it can. So it's a good thing to pay attention to. So let's talk about the difference between them. So what do they do? Well, these lipoproteins are transporters. Like I said, this cholesterol gets made in the liver, and then it carries it to the cells in the body to get used, right? So the LDL, or the low-density lipoproteins, their job is they actually take the cholesterol that's made in the liver and they bring it in the blood out to the cells in the body. So, your liver is actually right here, and I'm going to talk about that more in a minute. It's right below your lungs on top of your stomach. It's a big organ, and that's where all this cholesterol gets made. But somehow we got to get that cholesterol to the cells in our fingertips and the tip of our head. So that is done through these lipoproteins. So the low-density lipoproteins, or LDL, they carry it around the body. But here's the problem. Sometimes they don't go where they're supposed to go. Or sometimes if there's too many in the blood, they will actually just start dropping off the fat, the cholesterol, in the wrong place. And you'll end up getting these buildups in the blood vessels. And that's called plaque. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. HDL, or high-density lipoproteins, they're called the good cholesterol. And the reason why is because their job is they take the extra cholesterol that shouldn't be in the blood and they bring it back to the liver, and then the liver processes it and gets rid of it. So LDL is bringing excess. You need LDL. It needs to exist because that's the only way for the cholesterol to get from the liver to the body. But if there's too much of it, that becomes a problem. So let me just explain it maybe a little bit better, hopefully, with this picture. So here's your liver right here. So this is the liver in the body. And as you can see, this would be your stomach here, these are your intestines, everything else, here's your lungs. So the liver produces this cholesterol and it has to get taken out to the body. And that is done with our LDL, or low density lipoprotein. And then if there's too much in the blood, what ends up happening is that gets taken back to the liver by the HDL. So when would this be a problem? Well, let's say this is your blood vessel right here, right? And as you know, your blood vessels go from your heart, they bring blood to your lungs to get oxygen, and then the blood goes to your heart and it gets pumped out to your body, and then the oxygen gets dropped off and then it goes back to the lungs. So basically your blood vessels are like the superhighways of the body, and they're carrying blood and they're also carrying this cholesterol. So let's say what ends up happening is this is a blood vessel here and there's too many LDLs in the blood. There's just too much cholesterol in the blood. What's going to happen is you're going to start to see, I'm going to color it yellow, this fatty buildup in the blood vessel, right? So you start, this would be on the inside, right? And what would end up happening is, imagine if it was, a hallway. Think of the hallways at the end of the day, how crowded they get. Imagine if the walls kept getting smaller and smaller. It would be harder for that blood to pass through. So what would end up happening is that blood tries to come out. As the blood's passing through, it gets slowed down by this very thick plaque that will form. And what ends up happening is, so the LDL would be dropping it off, right? And then let's make a different color. And the HDL would be picking up the extra fat, and then that would bring it back to the liver. So the HDL's job would be to remove all this built up fat, while the LDL is actually dropping it off. And then finally, in this lesson, I just want to talk a little bit about the last part of this fat lecture, which are something called trans fats, or hydrogenated oils. Trans fats are the ones that you really don't want to eat. So saturated fats are not good for you, right? Too many saturated fats can lead to high cholesterol as well. But one of the things that really leads to it is something called trans fats. Trans means to change, right? And what a trans fat is, we talked earlier about how an unsaturated fat has some double bonds in there, and they don't have completely filled hydrogens, and they're liquid. What a trans fat is when you hydrogenate oils, and what you do is you add hydrogen to them. And when you add hydrogen to them, they go from being liquid to solid. They go from being an unsaturated fat to a saturated fat. But they're really not good for you. Your body can't process them very well, and what ends up happening is you get a much higher LDL amount, and that goes out into your blood and leads to some cholesterol problems. So there's a picture of Oreos here, and the reason why is because Oreos are notoriously really bad for you when it comes to trans fats. That cream in the middle, that is made of trans fats. Margarine it's kind of funny actually. I grew up in a time period where they were telling you butter's so bad for you. Don't eat butter. Butter's so bad for you. And they introduced this product called margarine, and margarine was supposed to be better for you. I can't believe it's not butter. You've seen it before. People still buy it. And it's supposed to taste like butter. And it kind of tastes like butter, but what it is it's a hydrogenated oil. It's a trans fat. They take the liquid oil and they whip it up and they add hydrogen to it, and when that happens, it actually will thicken and become a solid and become a saturated fat, and that's called a trans fat. And those are definitely something you want to avoid. Thank you very much.